Hey Ben, are you talking, Ben? Because you're muted.
There we go. Can everybody hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so welcome everybody to the third in our series of coffee, tea, and computational well-being talks. We've got Ryan Smith with us here today. Ryan's going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to have time for questions at the end. So if anybody does have a question, I'd ask them to raise their hand, and then one of the co-hosts can unmute you. Ryan Smith is I believe, the one of the principal investigators at the Laureate Institute for Brain Research, and also an associate professor at the University of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And Ryan's published a wide range of work on topics that all of us are interested in, and topics that are very relevant to the kinds of things that we're looking at in this special collection and this series of talks. And he's going to talk for us today on a computational neuroscience perspective on subjective well-being. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ryan, and we can get started. Welcome, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to have the opportunity to talk. So yeah, I really appreciate the invitation, and I promise I will try my best to stick to the 45 or to the 40 minutes. But I'm somewhat notorious for going over. So, but like I said, I will do the very best that I can. So I'm gonna be talking today on like the title says, a computational neuroscience perspective on subjective well-being. And a big part of this is motivated by the fact that we're actually, and I'll tell you about it near the end, in the process of starting some empirical studies, because we recently received a fairly large grant to try to look at different potential computational models of well-being that can actually explain and relate to specific computational mechanisms that we can measure using computational tasks or behavioral tasks with fMRI and EEG that will allow us to estimate individual differences in computational model parameters and try to relate those to subjective well-being. So just as kind of an initial outline, so first I'll give an introduction to subjective well-being itself, which may or may not be novel to the people in this audience. And then I'll give an introduction to the major computational modeling approaches that I'll touch on, so reinforcement learning and active inference. And then I'll present kind of a more integrative framework focused on motivating studies aimed at uncovering computational mechanisms that contribute to subjective well-being, which again is, like I said, a new kind of recent focus of some of the projects going on in our lab. So to start out with, so what does subjective well-being refer to? So first of all, the reason why people think subjective well-being is important, or at least one set of reasons, is because improving subjective well-being has been shown empirically to be important for promoting things like resilience, increased social support, physical health and longevity, work performance, as well as several other broader contributions to society. So it's generally kind of beneficial to society at large, as well as just for the person. Individuals reporting higher subjective well-being also tend to be healthier and live longer. They often engage in more frequent health behaviors. They have more successful marriages, more friendships. They report greater job satisfaction, as well as objective measures of better job performance. They tend to return to healthy emotional states more quickly after negative life events. But although much of the research in this area is correlational, which is part of what I'll point out is why computational modeling will be important as a way to advance the field further, there are also some established mechanisms, through which emotional health can also promote physical health along the lines of what this would suggest. And if people are interested, this is a paper from a few years ago, kind of outlining an embodied neurocomputational framework for better understanding biopsychosocial processes that can relate mental and physical health from a computational perspective. Now, like I mentioned, to date, the primary measures used to study subjective well-being have been based on self-report. But there are a few studies that have supplemented this with things like third-party reports from friends, family, and coworkers that do show some convergent validity. There are a couple studies now that have also linked subjective well-being to things like to more objective measures like smiling intensity, or stop working in, or the emotional valence of word choice, different peripheral physiological measures of stress and health, things like that. And there have also been efforts to improve subjective well-being through current invention or interventions focused on things like exercise, mindfulness, and metacognitive training. But one of my points or the motivation for moving in the direction I'll talk about is that these conventional kind of descriptive approaches, they have some limitations in their ability to provide insights beyond just associations between variables of interest. They don't quite give you the mechanistic and potential biobehavioral basis of these sorts of individual differences. And if we had those, then that would place less limitations on our ability to design more kind of personalized or mechanistically driven intervention approaches. So applying complementary approaches from neighboring fields could be an important way to move the field forward. So that leads to computational approaches, which everyone in this audience, or many people, I imagine, are pretty familiar with. But these are in part motivated by, or should be, by just considering the basic problem that any organism needs to solve, which ultimately is going to have to do with trying to maintain homeostasis through predictive allostatic mechanisms. And in this case, when we're thinking about reinforcement learning, we can actually think of actual or expected movement towards homeostasis as being something like the basis of what seems rewarding to us, and then vice versa for punishment. And that relates to something called homeostatic reinforcement learning that Karamati and colleagues have proposed. So in some cases, we can do this through just directly visceral sorts of actions or visceral regulation. So for instance, converting glucose into fat to keep blood glucose levels from getting too high. But in other cases, it requires skeletal motor action selection, like for instance, going to find water to prevent dehydration. So one issue is that doing this successfully requires use of noisy sensory information, because to maintain adaptive beliefs about the environment that we're in, and we need to be able to successfully predict how actions are going to affect those observations, like for instance, successfully finding water. So this is where things like approximate Bayesian inference come in to deal with this noisy sensory information. And then there can be multiple different models of how we might select actions once we have the predictions and we have beliefs about the states that we're in. So one very common approach, leading approach to action selection in computational neuroscience has been reinforcement learning. And there are various flavors of complexity in reinforcement learning models, but the simpler versions, more or less, they just learn an expected reward value for each possible action in each possible state that you could be in. And then more or less, you just choose the action with the highest expected value. But that often comes with a certain amount of randomness built into choice to promote exploration, which is important for various reasons. And these can also be extended to include more sophisticated directed exploration drives, things like upper confidence bound algorithms or Thompson sampling algorithms and things like that. And so for anyone who's not familiar, learning in these sorts of models is based on a particular kind of prediction error called a reward prediction error. And this is just the mismatch between the reward that we expect and the reward that we observe. So reward prediction error is just observed reward minus expected reward. It's fairly simple. And then you're just using it to update the new expected reward of an associated action in a state, just based on adding the reward prediction error to the old expected reward. But we also modulate how much we add of the reward prediction error we add based on a learning rate, just because if learning rate's too high, we don't want to kind of change our beliefs too much based on an observation that could have just been due to chance. So learning rate controls how strong the change in expected reward is after each reward prediction error. And this is important as one potential source or first mechanism that could relate to subjective well-being that we can measure, because if reward probabilities are expected to be stable, then learning rates should be low. Because unexpected rewards might just correspond to low probability events, essentially just noise. And so we don't want to change our beliefs a lot just due to some random noisy observation every now and then. In contrast, if we expect the environment to be volatile, so the reward probabilities are changing all the time, then learning rates should be high, because in that case, unexpected rewards are more likely to indicate that the reward probabilities in the environment have changed. So it's more likely to be unexpected observations are more likely to be signal as opposed to noise. So we should learn a lot from them. but that depends entirely on our own prior beliefs about how volatile or stable the environment is. So if we can estimate a person's learning rate, then at least in the particular context that we're looking at their behavior, that can give us some idea about their prior beliefs about how stable or predictable they expect the world to be. And there are multiple previous studies that have linked learning rates and the associated volatility estimates to anxiety. So it looks like there is already evidence for a relationship there. So and more recently, people have moved on to try to look at correlates of or the mechanisms that might underlie at least moment-to-moment changes in self-reported happiness with reinforcement learning. And the idea is that happiness or positive mood might be related to something like recent patterns in reward prediction errors. So greater momentary happiness in this case has been associated with several strong positive reward prediction errors in recent trials. So in other words, if things keep getting better than expected over and over again, then that is what looks like it relates to reward, or what relates to people's momentary reports of happiness. And it's not just the reward prediction error that looks like it's the best predictor of momentary happiness in these studies, but it's actually the reward prediction error modulated by the learning rate. So it's actually the amount that you update your beliefs as opposed to just the reward prediction error itself. So in other words, it relates to how surprising a reward is rather than just the magnitude of the reward itself. So if you're more surprised the reward was received, then people will tend to report greater increases in happiness. And relatedly, individuals also report greater momentary happiness during probabilistic learning tasks when the probabilities are more stable and predictable. So when the environment is expected to have low volatility. Whereas in high volatility contexts, people tend to report more negative emotions and more stress. So that would work against subjective well-being, at least a certain type of subjective well-being. And this is supposed to play or the suggestion is in this literature that positive and negative mood can play a particular functional role. So it can be useful in various ways. So what you can do, so this is just the actual equation proper, if people can see my cursor, but so mood changes just by taking your current mood and then multiplying that by the reward prediction, adding to it the reward prediction error times the learning rate minus your previous mood, and then modulated by some stability parameter. But what that ultimately just means is that mood should become more and more positive with each successive positive reward prediction error, where that stability parameter is actually what controls how long lasting the happiness effect is. So if the stability parameter value approaches 1, then people should have more long lasting positive mood states. And the functional role that this is supposed to play is that these mood biases, they bias subsequent changes in expected reward so that they're more consistent with recent trends. So if reward prediction errors keep getting better than expected, then if you get some objective reward, then that'll actually be biased toward being perceived as a little more rewarding than the actual objective amount based on this equation here. So you're just essentially biasing how much you update your beliefs about reward based on in relation to the mood. So if you're in a good mood, positive, then rewards just feel even better than expected. And the idea is that actually can be useful in guiding learning and expectations in environments where there are correlated increases in reward. So for instance, if you're moving from winter to spring and over again, you keep getting, oh, there's more food than expected, then it actually makes sense to keep anticipating that trend will improve and things will keep getting better. So you can actually learn the correct reward probabilities in the environment more quickly if you have this kind of momentum in how the rewards are perceived to be changing. Iran Elder and Yale Niv have actually shown some of this interesting work where if that mood bias is too strong, though, then you can end up with moods that become kind of unstable and kind of cycle up and down. So there is a vulnerability if the strength of that bias is too strong. But an important point to bring up here is that these studies have focused primarily on, as I mentioned, moment-to-moment happiness ratings. And that's pretty distinct from what a lot of the subjective well-being literature that I mentioned before has measured, because that's kind of more kind of like hedonic well-being, which is distinct from these more kind of stable, longer-term overarching measures of general life satisfaction or overall life functioning. Um, and Daniel Kahneman, for example, is famous for doing some work showing that there can be this disagreement between happiness and life satisfaction, where people can actually have less moment-to-moment happiness, but still later report being more satisfied with their lives overall than people who had more moment-to-moment happiness. Um, so more research is needed to understand the relationship between these computational processes and some of these established subjective well-being measures that are more about this kind of eudaimonic well-being that has to do with general life satisfaction, that can be more related to values, um, and moral beliefs and things like that that are, yeah, again, can kind of work against or not necessarily agree with moment-to-moment happiness. Um, and the other thing is that the reinforcement learning approach is selectively about learning expected reward, whereas other inference processes are also likely to be important that aren't really addressed here. Which brings us to this idea of probabilistic inference, which is what we need to do to kind of get our model of the world right, or at least get it in a way that's adaptive for informing action, in a way that's going to keep us in the states that we want to be in. And so the idea here, which again, many people in this audience should be very familiar with, is that sensory information, sensory signals themselves are always consistent with more than one interpretation. So we need some particular model of the world that gives us some prior beliefs to help disambiguate which state of the world we're in when that sensory input is consistent with lots of different interpretations. Um, and to relate this to things that are relevant to social well-being or to subjective well-being potentially, we can look at a social inference example. So here, let's just assume that we're looking at this particular facial expression, and we're trying to infer how friendly the person is. So in a Bayesian model, that means we'd have some distribution that we'd estimate over some dimension, like from, say, unfriendly to friendly. Where here you might say that this face all else being equal is probably most consistent, or would be most probably generated just by a person who was neutral with respect to friendliness. But solving that inference problem requires using something like Bayes' theorem, where we're just trying to estimate the probability that the person is friendly to some degree, given that facial expression, and we can just solve that in the standard way by multiplying the likelihood times some prior belief in our model. And so as a kind of common depiction of how the dynamics work here, let's say that our likelihood distribution is just basically saying that all else being equal, a neutral state is most likely to generate the pattern of the face that we're seeing. But if we had some prior expectation that they weren't very friendly, then we'd have a slight bias in that direction. So we'd perceive them as being mildly unfriendly. If in contrast, we had very precise beliefs that they were unfriendly here with this very kind of tight distribution in black, then we'd just be more biased toward them being unfriendly. And this is a type of passive inference that could bias us in ways to interact with others in the world that could promote better or worse social relationships overall. And importantly, for empirical work, we might want to come up with some sort of task where we could estimate individual differences in the precision of these sorts of prior beliefs, which could in turn also be an interesting predictor or potential predictor of subjective well-being or just general life functioning. But crucially, that's purely passive inference, what I was talking about right now or before. Whereas we also know that this more active notion of inference is important because people are choosing things to do, right? They're not just sitting back and watching. And part of active inference is goal seeking, like in reinforcement learning, where we're trying to achieve preferred outcomes. But at the same time, part of it is information seeking, where we're trying to take action specifically to improve our inferences. So in this case, maybe we would do something like, just say hi and see what happens to gather more information about whether the person is friendly or not. And what action we take there, might be really important for how the interaction would go. But so let's say we just choose to do that. And then when they say hi, all of a sudden they turn to make that facial expression instead, and they enthusiastically say hi. So in that case, our distribution would probably switch much more toward being confident that they're friendly. But we wouldn't have gotten that information unless we took the action to kind of figure out what would happen, right? So it's a kind of social disambiguating, sort of action to gain information. But there are lots of other actions you could take instead that, probably wouldn't be as effective. So individual differences there could also be relevant. Now, moving from this kind of intuitive notion of what I just called active inference, I'll point you to a couple of resources on recent work on predictive coding and active inference models that have already been applied in clinical neuroscience, as well as our recent more kind of in-depth tutorial on the formalism of these sorts of active inference models and how they can be applied to empirical data. Because I'm not going to have time to go in lots of detail about the formalism here, beyond what I'll need to do to just show you what sorts of other computational mechanisms could involve individual differences that might help explain differences in subjective well-being. So here's just a common depiction of the generative model that's assumed under the active inference formalism, and the big scary picture here of all the different equations for inference. Again, I won't go into these in detail here. Our tutorial goes into them in detail for anyone who's interested. Not all of it will matter for what I'm going to show here. The important part, just to walk you through the structure of these models, though, is you just start out with some observations at some time point, or at each time point that you're predicting or observing. And then we have some hidden states in the world that we're trying to infer. So we want to figure out what the world's actually like based on those observations. And then we have some mapping in our model, so which we just call A, so a set of parameters that just tells you what the most likely observations are under each possible state. And then we have some prior belief about the states at the first time point that we're considering. And so jointly, that prior and that likelihood, just standard Bayes theorem, will give us our approximate posterior over states for that first time point. However, because we're modeling dynamics over time, we also have prior beliefs about how states will change from one time point to the next. And so that's our B matrix here, just another set of parameters that entails individual differences in people's beliefs about how the world will change, and sometimes how that will depend on action. And that can just keep moving forward in time. So next, we have our approximate posterior beliefs about policies. So policies in active inference just correspond to an action plan, essentially a sequence of actions, or different possible sequences of actions that we're imagining, where those actions just control the state transitions. Now, we anticipate what policies are going to be better than others based on assigning value to those policies. And in active inference, that's based on expected free energy. And I'll go into what the expected free energy equation is in a second. But it in turn depends on what our preferences are. So what observations we prefer over others. And that is also in a set of parameters in this vector or matrix that we just label with the variable C. Now, there can be two additional relevant influences on policy selection. The first is this idea that we can have this prior over policies, which you can think about as a way of having different habits, or in modeling habit learning, where the agent essentially just believes, hey, I've chosen this policy the last 20 times. I'm probably more likely to choose that one again. And then the last part here is this gamma term and its hyperprior beta. And this you can think of as a precision estimate for the expected free energy itself. It's essentially something like how confident you are in your model of the world and your ability to select or predict the best actions. So then once we have that in place, then up here you can see what you ultimately do to infer what policy you're going to choose. And that's just by taking this, so the sigma here is just a softmax function. It's just turning what's in here back into a probability distribution. But you can see it's just kind of this trade-off between E, so your habits, and G, which is going to be your sort of the expected best actions under your model. And this gamma term here just controls the weighting of those two. So if gamma is a big number, then you're confident in your model, and so habits don't have that much of an effect. Whereas if gamma is a low number, you're not very confident, in the expected free energy. So you primarily are influenced by the habits you choose. So that's the formalism. And then you can also, and then beta here, sorry, is just a hyperprior on gamma. So you can estimate essentially a person's starting beta value in a task, and that can be an interesting individual difference that you can estimate that could potentially relate to subjective well-being. So just a couple of points to make here. So one is, if we're considering different policies, like I said, which are just sequences of actions, then it can be useful to just kind of point out how this might look in a little kind of toy task. So let's imagine I start at this kind of smiley face here, and what I want to do ultimately is get to my goal. And we'll just say that this goal is worth plus 50 reward. But there's also something difficult here, this little hill, whatever that is, could be something socially difficult. And we'll call that a value of minus 10. And then we'll just say all other states, when you move through them, all the other little boxes are just worth a minus 3. And we'll just say that's something like metabolic effort, metabolic cost of moving around. So then let's consider two policies. So policy 1 would involve those 10 actions, right? So imagining going through that sequence of states to get to your goal. Another policy might be this one, policy 2, which is 14 actions. It kind of takes a longer route. Now, if you were to imagine that the person can look ahead all the way, 10 steps or 14 steps, then it's pretty clear that you add all this up, and what you'll find is that that policy 1 ends up with a net value of plus 16, whereas policy 2 only ends up with a net value of plus 11, despite the fact that you had to go through this difficult thing to get to it with policy 1. But what's important here is planning horizon, which is the number of future steps a person can consider. So it could be that a person just has a really temporally deep model, and they have lots of time to think about it. They're willing to engage in a lot of cognitive effort. There's various sorts of modulatory factors here. You're in kind of a stable, low arousal state where you can actually kind of look ahead all the way. But people do have differences in planning horizon. So you can see right here, I just put that star there saying that the policy 1 would be the winner in that case. But you would only figure that out if you were looking far enough ahead. If you had a shortened planning horizon, so let's just say our planning horizon was only 9, then that means that you'd only be able to look ahead that far, right? So you'd get to 20, you could only plan ahead to 25 here, but not really think beyond that, and only to 17 here. In that case, if you were to add them up, then policy 1 ends up with an estimated value of negative 34 versus policy 2 is negative 27. So in that case, having not a deep enough planning horizon actually leads to the chosen policy, or what seems like the best policy is one that's actually very suboptimal. So planning horizon is another thing that you could estimate in different decision-making tasks, where you might think the differences in planning horizon could be an important predictor of who's selecting the sorts of optimal actions to maximize well-being and general kind of functioning in life, especially when something difficult to go through here, things like that are socially difficult, like say apologizing or reconciling, to try to fix some friendship, which might be really painful in the short term, but in the long term, you get your friend back and you have good social support. So things like that, where it could matter. So in that case, policy 2 would inappropriately win, was my point. So star there. So now with the expected free energy itself, another important difference comes out, or potential individual difference comes out when we consider the actual equation. And you'll see lots of different decompositions of expected free energy. So of each policy, so G pi here. This is one that I think is the most intuitive, where you have a term that corresponds to what we call epistemic value, and another one that's often called pragmatic value. Now, the epistemic value, if you can see, this is literally just what state you expect given a policy after an observation versus before an observation. So this is just saying how much essentially do I expect that my beliefs will change after I get some new observation. And the more your beliefs will change, the more information you're getting. And this term is made negative, so policies with lower expected free energy, which will be preferred, will be the ones that will change beliefs as much as possible. So we're actually kind of trying to maximize a prediction error in a certain sense. Whereas the pragmatic value is literally just your expected probability of getting the rewarding outcome, just getting what you prefer. So that's just kind of a standard reward seeking component. So what this means is that policies with the lowest expected free energy are going to simultaneously maximize preferred observations and maximize information gain at the same time. And there'll be a weighted trade-off between those two, which is crucial. And the reason is because having a more precise preference distribution is going to effectively reduce the information seeking. So in other words, if this distribution, this P of O given C here, if this is really, really precise, then this gets upweighted a lot compared to this epistemic value term. So the person doesn't seek out very much information and just becomes primarily a reward seeking, often being very risk seeking because they don't have enough information first. Now, this is just kind of a quick example of a task that illustrates this. So in this case, you just have two slot machines, and one will pay out $4 if you choose the right one, whereas the other will pay out $0. And you can either guess right away, or you can ask for a hint first about which one is the better one. But if you ask for the hint, you'll only win $3. So again, there's this trade-off between information seeking and reward seeking. And if a person just has a moderately precise preference distribution, they will take the hint first, and therefore they'll always win as long as the hint is reliable enough. So that would have an expected value of $3 on the whole. Whereas if a person has a really precise preference distribution, then they don't seek out enough information, and so they'll just tend to guess each time, and they'll get it right 50% of the time, so that have an expected value of $2. So in this case, information seeking would be better, but the person acts suboptimally because their preference distribution is too precise. And you can see how that kind of evolves over time with learning as well in these agents. And just to show you here, this is just plotting the first action that the agent takes in simulations here. So you can see it starts out taking the hint first a bunch of times, and then it starts choosing the left machine, and then it switches back and forth like that. So the darker the color, the higher the probability in the model, and the blue dots are the actual action chosen. So you can see if it's a risk-averse agent, then it learns over time that the left one is better at the bottom, but it changes its beliefs and starts exploring again after occasional unexpected losses. If you have a risk-seeking agent, though, with a precise preference distribution, then it will only take the hit once or twice, and then even if it gets some wrong occasionally, it just kind of persists in continuing to choose the left one, so it doesn't seek out information as much. So that kind of gives you a sense of the dynamics of what behavior might look like in different people if they had different preference precisions. Now, another important factor that could lead to individual differences is learning rate and forgetting rate. So this is just the equation that shows how learning works. Essentially, you're just updating your prior beliefs each time based on what you observe or what state you believe you're in. The important point here is just that you can have a forgetting rate, which means that previous learning ends up mattering less than new observations. You kind of overwrite previous beliefs, whereas you can have a learning rate as well, which is similar to in what we were talking about before. But in this case, in active inference, it's a little different because it means that beliefs solidify more quickly. So this is kind of a technical point that forgetting rate in active inference is actually closer to what learning rates do in reinforcement learning, but they can be distinct in active inference. So the point here is that we have all these different computational mechanisms, all these different parameters, and differences in individuals' behavior and in brain responses could be explained by different parameter values in this kind of model, whether it's a reinforcement learning model or an active inference model. So things like the precision of sensory signals or people's beliefs about them, people's precision or expected kind of precision of prior beliefs, or of how confident they are that states will transition in certain ways over time, differences in the expected free energy precision, so that beta thing I mentioned, preference precision, learning or forgetting rates. There's several things like this that could be different in different people that could contribute to how adaptive their decision making is, especially in social contexts that might be really important in determining or leading them to be in the sorts of situations that would promote subjective well-being in both the hedonic and eudaimonic sense. So we just want to find the set of parameter values in each person that best reproduces their behavior and can explain where these individual differences can come from at a kind of mechanistic computational level. So with that as a kind of background, I'll kind of briefly touch on example studies that we've done so far that have related inference to emotional health in ways that could relate to subjective well-being indirectly. So first, we've used interoception tasks like heartbeat tapping tasks where a person is just told to pay attention to their heartbeat and then just tap every time they think they feel it. And you can end up getting things like both false positives and false negatives. So here they forgot to tap, so they didn't feel it when it was there. And here they tapped where they thought they felt one, but there wasn't one. So you can get this effect of both prior beliefs and also about the sensory signal. And we've done a few studies looking at this now and estimating simple kind of Bayesian models under different conditions where people can just told to guess, where they're told they can't guess, and where they can't guess, but they also hold their breath. And the idea is that no guessing should affect their prior belief, whereas the breath hold should amplify the sensory signal. And so what we found here is that healthy participants do show an increase in estimated signal precision during the breath hold, whereas all of the patient groups, so anxiety, depression, comorbid anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and substance use disorders, all were unable to modulate, it looked like, their estimated precision of the sensory signal when the objective signal actually increased as a function of the breath hold. We've also done in a different context using gastrointestinal interoception, shown that these models look like they do explain, or parameters in these models related to learning rates, as well as precision estimates, can explain individual differences in event-related potentials and various other aspects of experience when people are doing these sorts of tasks with a similar model. In a couple different studies on in substance use disorders, we've used standard kind of information seeking tasks. This is a 3-arm bandit task where participants just have to choose between each of 3 options over and over again to figure out which one they think is the most likely to give them a reward. And using those sorts of models, we found that substance users show they show greater, or so they're healthy people show higher action precision, so they're more likely to choose the best option based on their past experience. And healthy controls also show much higher learning rates for negative outcomes in substance users. So there's this idea that drug use might continue despite negative outcomes if you just learn too slowly from negative outcomes. And if your action precision is low, then you're more likely to make inconsistent choices, even in response to positive outcomes, which seems kind of like a nice, or a recipe that seems like it would help maintain substance use disorders and promote relapse. We've also used same sort of model in a longitudinal study where we find these nice relationships between parameter estimates at baseline and how symptoms changed a year later. And so what these show more or less is that symptoms were lower 1 year later in people who at baseline had slower learning from negative outcomes, faster learning from positive outcomes, and that showed less information seeking. So it does look like these parameters can be relative, or relevant, I should say, to how treatment progresses over time, because these people were just entering treatment when we measured them the first time. Couple other examples. We've shown using approach avoidance conflict tasks in patients with depression and anxiety and substance use that there's parameters that have to do with preference precision and the beta parameter reflecting decision uncertainty or expected free energy precision. And here, what we find is that patients with depression, anxiety, or substance use disorders, they show greater decision uncertainty. They actually show less avoidance, so less conflict, which was an interesting finding. And that shows up, that's stable 1 year later, we've found. And in addition, we've now replicated this in a new sample. I'm going to skip a couple of these other things, but the overall point with this is we were able to use a model of antidepressant or adherence to antidepressants, where you could use the model to come up with kind of a questionnaire that we're currently trying to see if we can use it to predict adherence. And we've also done some studies simulating emotion concept learning and individual differences in emotional awareness, where one important point that comes out is the granularity of an emotion concept state space. So in other words, if you understand emotions as if you can infer them in terms of more granular and specific categories, then you just have more precise information to work with about your own emotions, which can help guide decision making in social situations in adaptive ways. So just kind of to finish off then, the research program that we're proposing on subjective well-being kind of builds on this in a particular way, where our long-term goals are just to improve our understanding of the mechanisms that contribute to it, produce some better measurement tools, and then hopefully find ways to use those to improve, so leverage those advances to improve the sorts of intervention strategies we might be able to come up with. And to do that, the overall computational sort of framework that we would propose would start out with a kind of looping perception action cycle, where we might just start out by saying an agent's trying to predict action outcomes when they're making a plan, which is constrained by their planning horizon. Then they have to consider both their preference precision and their expected free energy precision. That then leads to a decision, so seeking a reward first or seeking information first. And then you can get the action outcome, which is expected or unexpected. And then we have to perceive that outcome and adjust our beliefs accordingly, which is going to be affected by our prior beliefs and our sensory precision. And it'll also be constrained by the granularity of our model in terms of the number of states and the specificity of those states for understanding the world. Once we have that, we then update our beliefs, and that's going to depend on learning rates and forgetting rates, which in turn should be influenced by volatility estimates. And then the cycle goes round and round. So what we would be expecting is that planning horizon, typically, if it's longer, that should lead to decisions that promote the best long-term outcomes, but also it should probably be flexible and context dependent. Sometimes thinking about things for too long also isn't good. Our preference precision, if it's too low, we should have reduced goal seeking, but if it's too high, we should have insufficient information seeking and becoming too impulsive. If our expected free energy precision is too low, our behavior should either be overly random or overly habitual and insensitive to changes in action outcomes. Prior beliefs and sensory precision probably matter. So for instance, if our prior beliefs are optimistic, that can promote positive interpretations that are probably adaptive in many social situations, but sensory precision should also be at least moderate, so we can maintain belief accuracy, maintain like a good kind of concrete link where our, so that the actual signals coming in constrain our beliefs enough. Volatility estimates, again, if they're too high, we forget things quickly and our beliefs become unstable, where if they're too low, then we'll forget slowly and our beliefs could be too rigid. And then state space granularity, as I mentioned, where a finer grained state space is going to afford more precise inference to guide decision making. And so currently, we're developing a battery of tasks where we can estimate computational phenotypes. So including each of these parameters. So differences in expected free energy precision, directed exploration, action precision, volatility estimates, learning and forgetting rates, planning horizon, prior belief precision, sensory precision, et cetera. So we have a set of tasks we're using and developing social versions of where we can estimate these for each individual. And then we're imagining what we're going to get is that greater levels of well-being will probably be associated with values that are either not too low or too high relative to whatever the ground truth environmental statistics are. It's probably, for example, maladaptive to be either too confident or too uncertain. So there could be this kind of inverted U relationship. But you might also expect linear associations depending on the score ranges that you get, where high volatility might be bad or too little information seeking might be bad, et cetera. So we're just collecting a bunch of different measures of daily functioning, standard measures of subjective well-being in that literature, as well as standard symptom and other effective measures. And so we're hoping that we can correlate and see which computational parameters are predictive of differences in subjective well-being, so we can figure out what's most important. Maybe information seeking is important, maybe it's not, meaning maybe the learning or forgetting aspects are most important, or maybe it has to do with specific prior beliefs. We don't really know until we start looking at this more specifically to figure out what mechanisms actually matter for differences in subjective well-being that people have and people self-report, as well as their general life functioning. So we're hoping that can inform future experimental manipulations and preventative or therapeutic interventions we might come up with to target specifically the mechanisms that we figure out matter. So with that, I'd like to thank our funding source for this, which is the Wellbeing for Planet Earth Foundation, as well as the William K. Warren Foundation and the National Institute of Mental Health and of General Medical Sciences, and definitely to my lab members and the other collaborators in the field. So thank you very much.